Okay, welcome. Thanks for joining us. Sorry for the glitches this morning. We're still learning all the ins and outs of modern technology. Let me review that I'm going to make a bit of a presentation for a while. That will be recorded. Then we'll end the recording and open this up to a general discussion. So if you don't want your words recorded for eternity, they don't have to be. I want to say that we have been doing these classes on Tuesday mornings for some time now. They usually started off in a very, very informal way where members of the group brought questions or concerns. If they didn't have any, I always had a few things we could talk about. We now have more things we could talk about than we could ever imagine, but there are two things other than the basic crisis we're all facing that I'd like to deal with first. And before that, some calendar issues. Today's the 2nd, we can meet, all going well, on the 9th, the 16th, and the 23rd. The 30th of June, we're not going to meet. If you're wondering why, it happens to be our wedding anniversary, and maybe we'll be able to do something. I don't know what's doable around here, but still. Now, during July, officially, I'm supposed to be on vacation. I have offered, since, just to make life easier for everybody else, I will be leading Friday night and Saturday morning services via Zoom, online, whatever we want to call it during that time, but we might not have classes during that time. Everything is up in the air. Now, a couple of interesting points. One, some Jewish news, and the other, a question that was given to me. Jewish news. Just found out this morning that the new chancellor of the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York, that is the seminary for conservative rabbis, not reform, we're talking conservative rabbis here, which also has a huge department of everything else Jewish, has just appointed a new chancellor. That's the head of the organization, equivalent to the president of a university. And outdoing the reform movement, a woman, Shuli Rubin Schwartz, who is a respected historian of American Jewish life. We have two of her books here. And I just want to say the conservative movement outdid the reform movement in appointing a woman. The Reconstructionists outdid everybody. That's another story. That's my piece of Jewish news. More about that another time in another place. Now, I was sent a question about Jews in Eastern Europe, what we would today call Poland, Russia, Ukraine, etc. And I'm going to do this in the most abbreviated way possible and then offer to do maybe a couple of sessions on this later on. Jews started to come into that area in about the 14th century. Not many at first, but by the 20th century, in the millions, even in the 19th century. Where did the millions come from? There was an extreme growth in Jewish population, not through immigration, but lowering the death rate among infants and extending life expands, mainly through medical care and hygiene. So while there was a huge population growth in the old Russian Empire in general, among the Jews there, even more so. What did that mean? There weren't jobs, there was unemployment, there were all kinds of other social issues, all kinds of hatreds boiling under the surface. A lot of this in the general society was directed against Jews, and many Jews left, and that is essentially the origin of the largest part of the Jewish communities in the United States, in Britain, in France before the Jews came from North Africa, in Canada, and Israel. We were always taught they were trying to escape religious persecution and pogroms. There's an enormous amount of truth to that, but there's a huge economic factor as well. I can elaborate upon this at another time, and I'm excited to do that because it's a matter of extreme interest to me and always has been. But I feel we are haunted right now by the events of, I don't even want to say the past few days, the past hours. Every day it gets worse. We have a major pandemic on our hands. We're having gatherings, protests of hundreds and thousands of people when we're supposed to have social distancing. And don't tell me this won't cause a spread of the virus even more so. We've had economic disaster. Businesses are closing. There's unemployment everywhere. We've also seen destruction of businesses and loss of jobs. We saw on television an individual who was handcuffed and not resisting, killed, I'm going to use the word murdered, by a law enforcement officer while other law enforcement officers stood by. I would give that a matter of priority over the destruction of businesses. To be sure, that's serious too. There is no doubt whatsoever, but there is death. And there is death that is not the first time, it is not isolated. I also feel it is absolutely essential to distinguish between those who protest peacefully, those who loot, etc. And I also feel we have to be fair and say there's an overlap with those who protest and those who loot. You can do both. I'm not describing anything that I don't think is painfully obvious. Now, things got worse, in my opinion, yesterday. We talk constantly about this idea of the separation of church and state, and that's what enables us to have any kind of religious freedom in this country. I am constantly told, make sure you don't talk about certain things. Well, the barrier between church and state, in my opinion, was broken yesterday when the President of the United States exploited a church and a Bible for his political interests. There are people in this country who have said they are furious that houses of worship have been closed or attendance reduced. You can only have 10 people there, distancing and so forth, because that is a denial of their religious freedom. At the same time yesterday, tear gas was used to expel clergy from St. John's Episcopal Church in Washington, D.C. Clergy members were expelled from the patio of that building. The building had been set on fire, I believe, just a day or so before, and an effort was made by someone tossing a Bible around in his hand, and if you look carefully, I think he was holding it upside down, to make a comment that was purely political in nature. I would also say it is blatantly obvious that he was not wearing a mask, nor were the cabinet officers who were with him. While some people talk about First Amendment rights, he talked about Second Amendment rights. And there are many of us who are very, very concerned from a religious point of view. I also want to focus on one word that he used with regard to his message to the governors and the mayors. I'm not going to get into the legal constitutional issue as to what authority he has to send federal troops in. I'm not qualified to do that, and I don't want to get into that. That's a way of preempting somebody saying, are you qualified? Have you read all the legislation? No, I haven't. But he used the word dominate. In civil society, in civilized society, in open democracies, we don't dominate. That is what you have in totalitarian societies. There should be open, free discussion, freedom of assembly, freedom of speech. Obviously, we're opposed to the violence. And wherever the violence is coming from, whether it is just angry groups in society, whether there are outside agitators, whatever the color of their skin, we are not happy with that. I also want to say I understand when people say nonviolence didn't work. We've been hearing about it for 50, 60 or more years. We went through this over 50 years ago in my own personal experience. But just because nonviolence doesn't work doesn't mean that violence will. It will cause more destruction, more unemployment, more hatred, and more people saying we need to dominate others. So I am very, very concerned. I'm also concerned, and I have to phrase what I'm about to say very, very carefully, because depending on what I say and where, these are dangerous terms. Let me give you another example before I give my example. We've all heard about the right to life movement. That is a movement that is opposed to therapeutic abortion under any circumstances. I have said, you've heard me say it in sermons and other occasions, that that term right to life has been hijacked by certain people. I too am in favor of right to life. And my way of interpreting that, among other things, is to have health care and medicine available for people who need it, and that people shouldn't have to die because, for example, of the high cost of insulin. Black Lives Matter has become a very, very hot topic. If you say anymore that all lives matter, and I hope that's the way we feel, you're called a racist because the term all lives matter has been hijacked by certain people on the extreme right and religious fanatics who say that if all lives matter, then the lives of unborn children, I would call them fetuses, also matter, and abortion should be illegal. Terms that can sound rather innocent have heavy-duty meaning at all times. It is our obligation to try to understand how words are used and how they are understood. We can only do so much, but we need to remember how they are used. Now, there was an incident, 5 years ago, just outside of St. Louis, where some Jewish leaders, including one rabbi that I know, tried to get involved in support of the African American community. The response was that her support was not welcome because she, by definition, is a racist since she supports the state of Israel. And we have heard too many occasions, and it's out there now, that we hear about the genocide of the Palestinian people and the apartheid state of Israel. This should not be our main focus right now. Our main focus should be working together, not calling each other horrible names, not using the name calling, you've heard me say this a zillion times, that would get anybody suspended from middle school. We all have to work together. And if for one reason or another, I'm not too thrilled about a governor here or a mayor there, calling that person a name is not going to improve things in the slightest. I would hope that all communities can get together. I would also hope that it wouldn't hurt, and again, I'm speaking very personally here. If I were a police officer and I stood by while somebody was being killed and I didn't do anything about it, I would hope there would be consequences beyond just being fired. And I really think something should happen to those other police officers who were there when George Floyd was killed. I don't have a solution. At least I'm willing to admit that. I don't know how easy this is going to be. We're dealing with hatreds and concerns on both sides that have been simmering for generations. But look what happens. One wrong move. If one individual hadn't have gone into a certain store, if a person in that store hadn't have called the police, the world would be a different place. And it makes us realize that everything we do is so, so significant. I said last night as we were seeing things on television, all you need is one person to push another person, and the reaction, it could be disastrous. We need a different approach to the world. Threats don't help. Threats of counter-violence don't help. We need to work together. The Jewish tradition tells us that we need to work together, that we need to care about everybody. The Jewish tradition tells us that we need to support those who are suffering. I wrote a piece that we sent out as an e-blast, I guess just last week, and then reworked it for an article that should appear in the Jewish News that we should all get. It'll be a month out of date. Everything is if you write things a month in advance and there's a deadline. That on Shavuot, we celebrated the giving of the Torah. The Torah tells us how to have a civil society. It tells us how to treat other people. It tells us, and I here focus on the 17th chapter of Deuteronomy, that the king, the ruler, the government must know the law and operate under the law. So I open this up for discussion. I could go on. I'm looking at my watch. I could go on for hours on this. I have points that I have not developed. I have areas of concern that bother me considerably. I recommend very highly that you get online and read the comments of the Episcopal Bishop of Washington, D.C., what she said, and we heard her voice last night, and the text is available online. I recommend highly that you read all the comments from the Episcopal Church in the United States. They say it was their church, and imagine what our response would be if, let's say, we were evicted with tear gas from our synagogues so somebody could make a political point. Shall we end this part of the session, stop recording, and our producer and director, I could not do this myself, so I thank Corinne one more time, and I also tell her constantly, everybody needs to hear this, occasionally it is a good thing that we are not perfect at this, because our errors and our imperfections are a wonderful argument in favor of fundraising for our new sophisticated equipment and videographers that we need. If we come across to doing it in a perfect way, what do we need all this fancy stuff for? So I thank Corinne. I also need to thank Spencer, who's been coming in and out and directing me and making sure everything's okay. And the classic thanks one more time to the dog and the cat for not interrupting too much. Okay, shall we change